My name is Rebecca Slayton. I'm an associate professor in the Science and Technology Studies Department and the director of the Judith Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. Today's event is co-hosted by the Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies and the Jewish Studies Program. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homeland of the Gayokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. This land acknowledgement has been reviewed and approved by the traditional Gayokono leadership. And I'd like to begin our public events with this reminder of where we stand. Now I will introduce our speaker and the plan for today. Delighted to welcome Guy Viv, who is an associate professor in the Department of Foreign Policy and Global Security at American University's School of International Service. He also serves as the associate director of American University's Meltzer Schwartzberg Center for Israel Studies. He teaches courses on U.S. foreign policy, international negotiations, U.S.-Israel relations, and Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. He has a background in policy, having worked on Capitol Hill and for not-for-profit organizations that promote Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. His first book, Why Hawks Become Doves, Shimon Peres and Foreign Policy Change in Israel, was published by SUNY Press in 2014, and his latest book is titled Netanyahu versus the Generals, The Battle for Israel's Future, by Cambridge University Press. Looking forward to hearing more about that today. Welcome.
Thank you. I wrote this book because years ago, well before October 7th and the Gaza war, which I will get to, but years ago, I realized that there was a really interesting paradox, or what I thought was a very interesting paradox in Israeli politics. And that is that Benjamin Netanyahu, who is Israel's longest serving prime minister, he cultivated this reputation or this image as Mr. Security, quote unquote. And the public largely, at least until recently, fairly recently, kind of bought into that image. But the security establishment did not. And so for me, that was a very, very interesting puzzle to explore. Why is it that he has this reputation, this image as tough on security, the one person who can save the country from destruction and from terror? Why are members of the security establishment, specifically the heads of the IDF and the Mossad and the Shin Bet intelligence agencies, why are they so critical of him? And so that's what kind of set me off on this course. And I submitted the final proofs for the book, was told I can't add a single word on October 6th. I went to sleep on October 6th, it was a Friday, wondering, what am I gonna do on my first free weekend? The first weekend, I don't have to think about this. And of course, woke up the next morning with the tragic news, and it didn't take long for me to convince my publisher to allow me to at least include a little addendum to include obviously the events that unfolded immediately afterwards, which actually make the book, I think, more relevant than it was even when I started writing it. Since mostly graduate students are here and maybe some professors too, I'll just say a word about methodology. I looked at, and kind of theory, I look at the civil military relations literature as well as the literature on populism. And these are two kind of distinct literatures that normally are not studied together. And so I thought it would be, in order to explain this phenomenon, I have to really look at both. And my research is based on dozens of interviews that I conducted with retired former heads of some of these organizations that I mentioned, including a couple of active people in the military that I was not allowed to name, and kind of a slew of civil society leaders and some politicians, lots of off the record discussions, and and interviews as well. And meetings as well. So my key argument is that the reason that the public hasn't been in sync with the security establishment, at least until recently, is because the reputation of the IDF and the intelligence agencies have kind of diminished over the years, especially with the debacle of the Yom Kippur War 50 years ago, the 1973 surprise attack on Israel during the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. So that attack and subsequent attacks and kind of military debacles, even before this Gaza war, there were so many operations and a few wars vis-a-vis Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza that were inconclusive. There was the second Lebanon war, the first Lebanon war and the second Lebanon war for that matter, that were not huge achievements for the Jewish state. And so the reputation, the image that generals had in the past are not the same today. And so the public tends to kind of be dismissive sometimes of what they have to say. And given that there is this kind of gap, the populist nationalists who've been on the scene, especially in Israel since the 2010s, have exploited this opportunity to attack not just the kind of traditional institutions that we see being attacked in the US and Europe and elsewhere, the courts and the justice system and the media and education, even higher education. In Israel, that includes also the military establishment that is kind of seen as part of the quote unquote elite. And so this, I think, explains why there's this gap to a large extent. Now, when you look at what it is about Netanyahu specifically that the military opposes, that the IDF generals and the former heads, or current heads even, of the intelligence agencies, what is it about Netanyahu that they oppose? There are basically three major reasons. First is lack of an agreement on basic goals. And I'm not talking about the goal of securing Israel, of course. I'm talking about what kind of Israel do they want to see? And everyone here has heard of the two-state solution. Well, from the perspective of the security establishment, even if the two-state solution is not right now in the cards for many reasons, striving towards the two-state solution, keeping the door open to the two-state solution is very important, because the Zionist dream, at least as the founders of the state of Israel envisioned, was to have a Jewish state and a democratic state. And these are kind of two sides of the same coin as far as traditional Zionism is concerned. You can't have one without the other. And so the idea of Israel becoming over time an apartheid regime, something that many critics of Israel will use today, that may or may not be the case, depending on your perspective and what you can, and kind of how you define that. But the trajectory seems pretty clear that if Israel is to, maintain this occupation indefinitely or annex the territories, the occupied territories, Israel will cease to be a democratic state and may even cease to be a Jewish state if we're looking at demographics, given the demographic realities. So there's that disagreement. And then there are other disagreements as well. For example, how to best thwart the Iranian nuclear program is, again, the goal is to thwart the program, but the ends and how to do it, the means towards that end is kind of a big question there. So in addition to lack of an agreement, there's lack of confidence in Netanyahu. They see Netanyahu as a man of rhetoric, a man who gives speeches, who's well known for being the kind of great communicator in Israel, which is rare among Israeli politicians, and somebody who relishes in the opportunity to, as he did recently, address a joint session of Congress. So this is something that, from the perspective of the security establishment, isn't all that impressive, because primarily we're dealing with men of action that care less about words and more about action. And they kind of see him as somebody who tends to be indecisive quite often, and somebody who also is a serial blunderer. So his judgment is often questioned. One of the major leaders of Hamas, Khalid Mashal, was in Jordan, was stationed in Jordan in the 90s when Netanyahu first became prime minister, had the guy assassinated by poison. The would-be assassins were, i.e. the Mossad agents, were caught. King Hussein of Jordan was furious, and Netanyahu then had to go back and send somebody there to administer the antidote. So he rescued the Hamas leader he was set on eliminating. And the same thing goes with the current Hamas major leader in Gaza, Sinwar, who was released from an Israeli prison under Netanyahu's watch during the Gilad Shalit prison exchange deal, where one Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, who had been held captive for 5 years by Hamas, was released in exchange for well over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners with blood on their hands, including Sinwar. So they take a look at, and these are just a couple of the decisions, but there are many others that were not supported by the military and the intelligence agencies. And finally, lack of trust in Netanyahu. So in addition to lack of an agreement, lack of confidence, there's this lack of trust in Netanyahu because unlike other prime ministers that they may have served under, Netanyahu is not seen as somebody who's looking out, who's putting the nation's interests first. And this is especially the case in the last couple of years, where he has been, he's the first sitting prime minister under indictment, and he is somebody who is likely to go to jail, perhaps, if he is found guilty. I mean, the trial has been dragging on, but he has a vested interest in remaining in power. He also sees the polls out there. There's no way he'll be able to form a new coalition, a new government, if elections were held today. He knows that. He's well aware of that. So his goal is to stay in power as long as possible. And that seems to be driving so many of his decisions. And that too is something that they're very critical of. I want to say a few words about civil-military relations in Israel. And as I said, I caught the tail end of the discussion you had earlier. So, but you read the article, and in Israel, unlike most Western countries, most Western democracies, there's blurring of the lines between the military and the political establishment. It's much more fluid. There's more of a partnership between the military and the civilian, and that's something that's been the case pretty much from day one. That's not a new phenomenon. And IDF oversight has never been particularly or strong. And that doesn't mean there's going to be a coup. A coup is not in the cards, has never been in the cards. But but from a kind of a Western perspective, it does raise eyebrows about the extent to which a general will influence or can influence foreign policy and national security. And one of the interesting manifestations of this kind of blurring of the lines is what happens once a general retires. In Israel, it's very common for generals to parachute into politics. It's this phenomenon of IDF chiefs and former generals who decide to continue their public service via politics. And so they enter the political arena. Israel has a strong tradition in that. 3 of the country's prime ministers were former IDF chiefs of staff. 2 were former IDF chiefs of staff, 3 were former generals. The vast majority of former IDF chiefs, the IDF, of course, is the Israeli Army, Israel Defense Forces. So the vast majority of the IDF chiefs have gone into politics. And what's I think very significant is that most of the ex-generals who've gone into politics have aligned with parties or foreign parties that were kind of center left. So to the left of dominant Likud party, which is Netanyahu's governing party. And the Likud prime ministers, from the first one, Menachem Begin, to Yitzhak Shamir, to Netanyahu, have also had this tradition of choosing one of these generals, one of these ex-generals, who, as I said, more or less center-left politics, as their defense minister, to kind of add some legitimacy to their governments. And invariably, there'd be some sort of falling out or disagreement between this general, this ex-general, and the prime minister, and they would leave. And this happened under Begin, this happened under Shamir, and it's happened multiple times with Netanyahu. So it's not only Netanyahu, it's also the policies that these right-wing leaders have pursued, but nothing has come close to the tensions and the ire that they hold towards Netanyahu. And when Netanyahu, I mentioned he was first prime minister in the 90s, he lost his re-election in 1999. So first time he ran for re-election, his government fell short of its full 4-year term. He runs for re-election, and his defense minister at the time, an ex-general, Yitzhak Mordechai, formed a new party, a center party, with the then outgoing IDF chief of staff, Amnon Lipkin-Shahak, and they challenged Netanyahu and were very critical of the way in which he had run the country and, among other things, not being serious about the peace process, the then Oslo peace process. And it was another ex-general, Ehud Barak, who was heading the Labor Party, that ultimately defeated Netanyahu and became prime minister, short-lived prime minister, but nevertheless, the conclusion that Netanyahu drew from that humiliating defeat was that the generals are his rivals, are his chief rivals. And so during his years kind of in the waiting, when he was kind of plotting his political comeback, one of the moves that he did through his proxies, he doesn't have his name behind it, but it was done through his proxies, was to pass a legislation in the 2000s called or known as the Chalutz Bill or the Chalutz Law. Now, Dan Chalutz was a then popular IDF chief of staff who was thought to be a future prime minister. And this was right before the Second Lebanon War that kind of proved to be less than successful. And so he never did enter politics. But at the time, he was thought to be kind of the next big thing. And so he passed this legislation that prolonged the waiting period, the mandatory waiting period, from 6 months to 3 years. And the rationale behind it from those who supported this legislation was, in a democracy, we want to kind of prevent a conflict of interest. So it is in the democracy's best interest to have the generals sit it out for 3 years. And then if they want to join politics, they can enter politics, as opposed to just 6 months, which isn't enough time. But the real purpose behind it was to thwart the generals from into politics. That was the real purpose behind it. And because 3 years later, who's going to remember them? Many people will have forgotten them, and they're just not going to be as popular, and perhaps they might even be too old to run for politics, run for office. So this was a very effective tool. And then in 2019, 2020, there were, right after his indictment, Netanyahu's indictment, there were 4 back-to-back inclusive elections that brought an unprecedented number of ex-IDF chiefs into the political fold. And this was something that was really unheard of before, to have so many IDF chiefs running and challenging the prime minister, trying to send him into retirement, was unprecedented. And yet they were only partially successful, because he was voted out for a year and a half before he won the 5th election. And we'll talk more about that later. I mentioned that there's kind of a blurring of the lines between the military and political establishment. This goes way back. And even in the 1950s, when Ariel Sharon was a general, a young commander, actually, before he became a general, he pursued his own counter-terror operations against Jordanian Fedayeen, who were then the kind of terrorists of the day. Oftentimes pursuing these counter-terror operations without getting explicit authorization from the prime minister. He often didn't even follow his own orders. By the mid-1960s, it became common for an IDF chief, including Yitzhak Rabin, who was then the IDF chief, to give media interviews about politics. That's something you wouldn't see in the States and in most countries. And in fact, it was the generals during the 60s that pushed then Prime Minister Levi Eshkol to initiate a war, the 1967 war, but they were trying to get him to do that in 1966, while Israel had the advantage, the strategic advantage, and the prime minister refused to do so without the green light from the US president. And it took more or less an amber light from LBJ, from President Johnson, until he was convinced that the United States was not going to be opposed to doing this. But there was practically a revolt in the security establishment because they felt Israel was losing an opportunity while they had the upper hand to defeat its enemies in the Arab world. In the 1980s, when the same Ariel Sharon, who was the young commander who disobeyed orders he was given from above, when he became defense minister, he gave an order to assassinate Yasser Arafat, PLO leader Yasser Arafat. And this was an order that was made very, very clear to the army. There were several opportunities where they had Arafat within shot, and they decided, the military decided to disregard the order because they felt it was too consequential and not necessarily in a positive way for Israel's security. And so they continuously disregarded orders from above. And more recently, the generals were also associated with the peace process in the sense of convincing Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1992 to pursue a deal with Yasser Arafat, the same Yasser Arafat, the same PLO, because they felt that was the only way to not only end the Intifada, but bring about a real change in Israel's outlook. And so the generals were kind of brought into the cabinet room, as Yoram Perry writes in his book, Generals in the Cabinet, in a way that's, again, very different than what we would see in the Western world. But generals were involved in the peace process, and the heads of the intelligence agencies were involved in the peace process. It wasn't just political appointees or political figures. And this was something Rabin did. This was something that Shimon Peres did after Rabin was assassinated, and he briefly took over. Once Netanyahu becomes prime minister, however, he distances the generals from the decision-making. He kind of sees them as part of the left, doesn't trust them. He wants to bring in his own people. And so there's already from day one some tensions between Netanyahu and the security officials. I mentioned at the start that the image of the generals has evolved over the years because primarily of debacles like the Yom Kippur War. And I mentioned some of the failed operations vis-a-vis Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip. There were 2 wars in Lebanon, neither of which was seen as a major success story. And so these losses, coupled with the association that the IDF had with the ill-fated peace process of the 90s, kind of diminished their image in the public eye, which is why when generals speak out nowadays in Israel about what they don't like in the political arena, the public doesn't take them as seriously as they would have when they spoke out in the 50s and in the 60s and up until the Yom Kippur War as well, where Moshe Dayan, the famous iconic general with the eye patch, any word he said, people would listen to and take very, very seriously. Same with Rabin. When Rabin was the general, that is no longer the case today. And of course, I don't need to tell you that the October 7th debacle, which took place almost exactly 50 years to the day of since the Yom Kippur War, after the Yom Kippur War, that also had tarnished to a large extent the heads of the security establishment. So, given this kind of gap, the populists enter the populace here, and in Israel, we've seen populist politics even longer than we've seen it in the States and in the UK with Brexit and other parts of the world. It's been around even longer in Israel, and Netanyahu has a lot to do with kind of using populist politics to pursue his ends. He didn't start out as a real populist politician, became much more so, however, with time, and began to surround himself with loyalists, many of whom took on that kind of populist mantra. And so during Netanyahu's term in office, we've seen populist legislation. For example, the Jewish nation state law of 2018, very controversial law that was unnecessary, really. And what it did was enshrine this idea that Israel is a Jewish state, but left out other parts of what you would find in the Declaration of Independence, what you'd find in other documents and various other bills, which is that there's equality, or at least in theory there's equality, and should strive for equality. All of that is left out of this nation state bill, and even the Druze, who are Arabs that actually do serve in the IDF, unlike other denominations, they do serve in the IDF and rise to the ranks of generals. They were excluded as well because they're not Jewish. And so there was a big outcry, major outcry against this legislation, but it's just an example of this kind of populist and nativist type of legislation. And we've seen it in the media as well. Netanyahu, on the one hand, is very critical of the media. And during the Trump era in particular, adopted the same kind of discourse, fake news, there's a witch hunt, same kind of, words that we hear from Trump. He began to adopt those as well. So, but while he's attacking the media, he made it a point to get funding for his own version of Fox News in Israel, his own version of not just in cable TV, but also a newspaper funded by one of his major donors that in Israel is regarded largely as a pro-Netanyahu or Netanyahu's mouthpiece in a sense. So he's using the media while he's attacking them, and his son is part of a new generation of young social media activists who's very active in social media, and almost every tweet or post has this kind of populist nationalist bent to it. Couple incidents I want to mention, 3 incidents that took place in 2016, which was a pivotal year for populism, nationalist populism in Israel. First, there was Eisenkot's high school speech. So Eisenkot was the then IDF chief of staff, Gadi Eisenkot, who was invited to speak to high school students. Now, this was a time where they called it the knife intifada. There was a period of time, unrest, where people were stabbed. And so he was asked about it in his high school address. And I'm just gonna quote from Eisenkot, who said, when there's a 13-year-old girl holding scissors or a knife and there's some distance between her and the soldiers, I don't want to see a soldier open fire and empty his magazine at a girl like that, even if she's committing very serious act. Instead, he should use the force necessary to fulfill the objective. In other words, he's really kind of pushing back against this kind of populist calls for disregarding the rules of engagement and the IDF code of ethics, and he's promoting those ideals and those values, and and kind of dismissing the outcry in the public, especially among younger people, to be more aggressive and to fight more harshly against attackers. And this is followed a few months later by Elor Azaria, the case of Elor Azaria, which I think we talked about last night. So Elor Azaria was an unarmed Palestinian assailant he was an armed Palestinian assailant, but he was held down after his actions, and the soldier decided to shoot him anyway, even after he had been disarmed. And this was caught on video, and this kind of became a big issue in Israel. The commander of the IDF general punished him because he had violated the IDF code of ethics. This was an assailant who was no longer in harm's way. And the fact that he was arrested within the army became a kind of outcry among people in the general public, but that was fueled by populist politicians who called for who almost elevated him in some respect, but said he should be released, that he's somebody who tried to protect himself and other people from harm, that he was essentially killing a terrorist. What's the problem with that? And so there was a major public outcry about that, and Netanyahu's loyalists were part of that push to release him. And Netanyahu himself, who at first didn't take a strong position on this, and in fact seemed to support the commanders, once he realized where public opinion was going here, he called the parents, and this was made very public, the parents of the kid, and said he was going to work towards his release. Shortly after that, the third incident that year was a speech that the then IDF Deputy Chief of Staff Yair Golan gave at the Holocaust Remembrance Day. And in that controversial speech, Yair Golan talks about how there are some very disturbing processes in Israel that are reminiscent of the Weimar Republic. That was not a comparison that went over too well in Israel. And even after he kind of clarified his remarks and said, I wasn't comparing what's going on here to the Nazis, of course, but I'm saying that there are some fascist tendencies here that we need to clamp down on, because this is very dangerous for the country. And he was ultimately denied a promotion to become the IDF Chief of Staff, and is today the head of the Labor Party in Israel, of the kind of center-left party that he's rebranded. It's called the Democrats now. We'll see how they fare. And so what we've seen in recent years is attacks by Netanyahu's loyalists on the security chiefs, on the intelligence chiefs. And this is something that began maybe in the 2010s or so, but has become much more blunt and much more extreme over the years. And you have Netanyahu loyalists who basically call them leftists, who call them cowards, who say that they're not, they don't know what they're talking about. That they've been wrong so many times, why should Israelis listen to them? And these are voices from the right. You don't hear that from the left, you don't hear from the center, you hear from the right. And we're not even talking about necessarily the ideological right, we're talking about the kind of right-wing populists that Netanyahu has over the years embraced. So I want to bring us to the last year and a half or so, because in the last year and a half, or I should say almost 2 years now, because Netanyahu was reelected in December of 2022, formed the most extreme government Israel's ever had, composed of far-right and religious parties. And this is something that even Netanyahu would not have established, would not have done in years past, but I think he concluded correctly that he would not be able to form another coalition. And so he was able to kind of orchestrate a merger of far-right parties for the express purpose of bringing them into the Knesset so that he can form a coalition. And he then gives them top posts in the security cabinet which of course is opposed by actual IDF and intelligence officials. There were protests throughout 2023 that were aimed at thwarting the government's plans to weaken the Supreme Court. The top priority of this new government was to restructure the courts so that they wouldn't have so much power, so much influence as they felt. And now in Israel, you don't have the kind of intricate checks and balance system that we have here. So the Supreme Court is pretty much it to a large extent. And their goal was to weaken the Supreme Court so that the elected officials, this is very much kind of a majoritarian approach, the elected officials would decide everything and not have their legislation vetoed and outdone by the justices who tend to be more on the left. And this brought out an unprecedented wave of demonstrators in Israel. And leading the demonstrations were IDF reservists. So these were not just regular reservists, although there were plenty of those too. We're talking about high-profile our IDF Air Force pilots. We're talking about intelligence, people in kind of intelligence units, people who are called on to do very serious things, whether it's bombing sorties in Gaza or thwarting the Iranian nuclear program through various intelligence, clandestine means. These are people who are called to do these things, who are saying, we're not going to do that. We're not going to show up to volunteer for our volunteer reserve duty if this legislation is passed. And this almost paralyzed the country to the point that forced Netanyahu to put this legislation on hold. And I think this was one of the reasons, not the only reason, that Hamas felt that maybe they had an opportunity while the country was being torn apart by this Supreme Court legislation, by this judicial legislation. This was a good opportunity to attack Israel. And of course, that happens on October 7th, where you have, 1,200 Israelis are murdered. You have Israelis who were raped and massacred. There was looting as well. And the rest, of course, you're aware about the Gaza war. I'm sure you follow it closely as we all do. And Netanyahu is one of the few people who has not yet taken responsibility. I was just reading this morning, that there was another IDF official who was involved in intelligence who decided to resign today. And the IDF chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, is expected to resign. He took responsibility. The former Shin Bet had resigned. He took responsibility. So you have all these people taking responsibility for their part in not foreseeing and not preparing Israel for October 7th, but Netanyahu has not yet done so. And so the polls today demonstrate very clearly that Netanyahu would not be able to form a coalition. And even though his party sometimes is either tied or in some polls, it might still be number one, that's mainly due to the splits in the opposition. The opposition is not united, and that's really worked in Netanyahu's favor because you have so many opposition parties and so many different opposition leaders who would like to be the next prime minister. And unless they're united, it's going to be a problem for them. But even if there were elections today, and even if Netanyahu does better than expected, there is no possible way that he would be able to form a coalition, which is why he believes that it is in his best interest to prolong this Gaza war. He has not demonstrated any sincere interest in concluding a hostage deal, which is not at all to say that Hamas isn't doing its part to thwart a hostage deal. I have nothing positive to say about Hamas, but Netanyahu too has not been helpful. And President Biden has tried to work with them and has been repeatedly rebuffed by Netanyahu because I think, and many others think, because of Netanyahu's political and personal needs that tend to trump national security needs. So I want to end actually on a positive note, which is hard to do in a time like this, but just give a couple of thoughts And then I would love to hear your questions and your own thoughts. The first point is that the demonstrations that we've seen now in Israel for the past 2 years, the pro-democracy demonstrations in 2023, and then the more recent ceasefire hostage deal demonstrations, that's something that is in Israel and in many other parts of the world would be considered unprecedented, because we're talking about such a large number of citizens who are going out week after week after week. You'd think they'd get tired after a while. And they're returning to the squares, they're giving up their evenings, their Saturday nights to join these demonstrations in very large numbers. There was one study that showed that over 20% of Israelis attended at least one of those pro-democracy demonstrations. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen anything like that in our country here. And that could be kind of a masterclass also for other countries that are facing challenges to their democracy, possibly our own. We'll see what happens. And then the other kind of positive note I would like to end on is that as difficult as it is, as hard as it is to be optimistic right now in light of the developments in Gaza, in light of the leadership or lack thereof in the Middle East, sometimes from tragic events, we have openings, we have political opportunities. And in Israel, we saw that 4 years after that devastating Yom Kippur War, Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian leader who had attacked Israel in October of '73, goes to Jerusalem, addresses the Israeli public, and ultimately makes peace and pays with his life for that decision. The same goes for the first Intifada, the first Palestinian Intifada, which paved the road for the Madrid Peace Conference and the Oslo process as well. And very recently, there are indications that Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Arab world are interested in potentially normalizing relations with Israel once there is at least hope for a two-state solution. So I'd like to end it on that note, and I'm happy to take your questions.